Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The first time RJ noticed Commodity was out about Dylan. It wasn't the way she spoke or the way she moved through Forrester creations with quiet confidence, but the way her eyes dallied on familiar faces like she was searching for commodity she'd lost, commodity only she could see. And it unsettled him further than he watched to admit, because in a place like Los Angeles where everyone had a history and half the people had secrets, there was still commodity about Dylan's presence that felt heavy, nearly haunted, as if she were carrying an entire history on her shoulders. And it started with small moments that didn't make sense, like how she knew the layout of the structure without being shown around, or how she squinched whenever Steffi's name came up in discussion, or how her aspect softened whenever RJ mentioned Luna, the girl who had faded from their lives after that woeful reproach that everyone pretended not to flash back. And at first RJ brushed it off as coexistence because Forrester was full of people with complicated stories, but the apprehension grew stronger when Dylan began asking questions that felt far too particular, questions about his knowledge, about Brooke, about what it was like growing up with the constant pressure of being a Forrester, and especially about Luna, whose name she said with a strange blend of reverence and pain, as if she were speaking about herself without realizing it. And the more RJ observed her, the more he felt that quiet pull of familiarity, like he'd known her ahead, not in this life but in another interpretation of it, one that had been cancelled and rewritten. And it wasn't until he set up an old medical train left before in one of the administrative services during a late-night design review that everything began to fall piecemeal, because put away between fiscal reports and fabric samples was a brochure labeled with a different name, a name he hadn't heard in times, Luna Nozawa, and inside it were surgical records, recovery notes, and a set of before and after photos that made his blood run cold wave, because the woman in the before prints was unmistakably Luna, fragile, alarmed, and bruised by the life she'd been forced to live, while the woman in the after prints was Dylan, polished, confident, and nearly unrecognizable except for the eyes, those same eyes that still carried the weight of everything she had survived. And RJ stood there in the silent office, the megacity lights glowing through the glass walls, trying to move himself that it couldn't be true, that there had to be another explanation, but the substantiation was inarguable. Luna hadn't faded, she had converted, reshaped her face, her identity, her entire actuality, and walked back into their lives as someone new. And when RJ brazened Dylan laterally that night in the empty design plant, his voice shaking with unbelief as he rumored, "You're Luna," the look on her face told him everything he demanded to know, because for a moment the mask slipped, the confident posture atrophied, and he saw the girl who had formerly stood in the murk of Forrester creations, hopeless to belong, hopeless to be loved. And Dylan didn't deny it, she didn't scream or run, she simply exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath for times and said that she had done it to survive, that after everything that happened, the falsehoods, the treason, the demotion, the way the world had turned on her, she couldn't stay the same person, because that person had been broken beyond form. And RJ felt his heart crack as he realized that Luna hadn't just changed her face, she had changed her entire future, leaving behind the girl he formerly knew to come someone strong enough to walk back into the same world that had nearly destroyed her. And as Dylan, or Luna, explained how she had faded after the reproach, how she had used what little plutocrat she had to find a surgeon willing to abolish her history, how she had rebuilt herself piece by piece until she was no longer recognizable, RJ plotted to reuse the verity, because part of him was angry that she hadn't trusted him, angry that she had kept such a massive secret, but another part of him understood that occasionally survival meant getting someone differently entirely. And as the two of them stood there in the quiet plant, girdled by untreated designs and forgotten dreams, RJ realized that the real shock wasn't just the plastic surgery, it was the emotional scars that Luna still carried beneath the face, scars that no surgeon could abolish. And when news of Dylan's true identity ultimately gurgled through the Forrester family like a tidal surge, responses ranged from unbelief to sympathy to outright fury, because some people felt betrayed, others felt shamefaced for how they had treated Luna in the history, and many saw her metamorphosis as evidence that the system had failed her, that the glamorous world of fashion and power had masticated her up and spear her out, forcing her to resuscitate herself just to survive. And while Brooke plotted with the idea that she had formerly turned her back on a vulnerable youthful woman, Steffi scuffled with her own undetermined guilt, wondering if effects could have turned out else if she had shown more compassion. And through it all, Luna, now living as Dylan, remained calm and composed, because she had formerly lived through the worst, and nothing anyone said could hurt her further than what she had formerly endured. But for RJ, the disclosure changed everything, because he wasn't just looking at a foreigner presently. He was looking at someone who had been part of his history, someone whose story had been cancelled and rewritten, and as he watched her walk through Forrester Creations with her head held grandly, he couldn't help but respect her strength, indeed as he mourned the loss of the girl she used to be. And in the end, the biggest shock wasn't that Luna had changed her face, it was that she had set up the courage to return to the place that had formerly broken her, determined to make a future on her own terms, proving that occasionally the most dramatic metamorphoses aren't about appearance at each, but about reclaiming your identity, your voice, and your power in a world that tried to take it all down. After the Verity eventually came out, Forrester Creations no way felt the same again, because indeed though Dylan or Luna tried to move forward as if nothing had changed, every hallway she walked through carried echoes of her history, every regard from a colleague felt loaded with questions, and every smile she offered was met with query, as if people were still deciding whether she was the victim of a cruel world or the mastermind of her own deception. And while the company pretended to return to business as usual, the emotional foreshocks of her disclosure continued to ripple through everyone's lives, especially RJ's, who couldn't shake the feeling that he'd uncovered commodity far bigger than just a ornamental metamorphosis, because the further time he spent around Luna, the more he realized that her new identity wasn't just a mask, it was armor, precisely constructed to cover her from ever being helpless again. And yet, beneath that polished surface, the girl who formerly believed in people too fluently was still there, still watching, still hoping, still alarmed of being hurt each over again. And RJ set up himself caught in the middle of it all, torn between the recollections of who Luna used to be and the reality of who she had come, because while Dylan was confident, strategic, and emotionally guarded, Luna had been open, vulnerable, and hopeless to belong, and the discrepancy between those two performances of her made him question whether true change was ever really possible or if people simply learned to hide their pain more. And as the days passed, whispers spread throughout the company, some workers averring that Luna had every right to resuscitate herself after what she'd endured, while others still indicted her of manipulation, claiming that changing her face and name was a calculated move designed to re-up Forrester's elite circle without facing responsibility for her history. And indeed though Luna refused to intimately defend herself, the pressure in the air was insolvable to ignore, because every discussion felt like it carried an implied judgment, and every silence felt louder than words, and yet, through it all Luna remained collected, nearly detached, as if she had trained herself not to watch what people allowed. But RJ knew better, because he could see the cracks in her armor during quiet moments, like when she dallied by the windows overlooking the megacity, her expression softening as if she were flashing back the girl who formerly pictured of a future that didn't involve survival tactics and reinvention. And it was during one of those moments that RJ eventually asked the question that had been hanging him since the night he discovered her secret, why she had chosen to come back, why she had walked straight into the very world that had nearly destroyed her. And Luna, after a long pause, admitted that leaving hadn't been enough, that no matter how far she ran or how important she changed, Forrester Creations represented untreated business, a chapter she couldn't close until she faced it on her own terms, because walking down had felt like losing, and returning as Dylan felt like reclaiming control, and RJ, hearkening to her explain how she had rebuilt her life from nothing, how every surgical procedure had been both a physical and emotional reset, began to understand that her metamorphosis wasn't about vanity, it was about survival, about getting strong enough to live in a world that had formerly treated her as disposable. And yet, despite his growing empathy, RJ couldn't ignore the sense of loss he felt for the Luna he'd known, the bone who laughed fluently, trusted too deeply, and believed that people would always do the right thing, because that interpretation of her had dissolved, replaced by someone who calculated every move and guarded every emotion. And while that made her important, it also made her lonely, because true connection needed vulnerability. Commodity Luna no longer allowed herself to feel, and as the company prepared for its biggest fashion show of the time, the pressure inside Forrester Creations boosted, with pressures rising, alliances shifting, and old injuries continuing, because Luna's presence had forced everyone to defy their once choices, especially those who had formerly dismissed her or failed to cover her. And nowhere was that further apparent than in Steffi's internal struggle, because while she maintained her authoritative countenance on the outside, intimately she scuffled with the guilt of how she had formerly viewed Luna as insignificant, realizing too late that incuriosity could be just as damaging as atrocity, and indeed Brooke set up herself reflecting on her own part in the events that led to Luna's exposure, questioning whether her focus on family drama and commercial power had dazed her to the struggles of someone who demanded support. And as the emotional weight of the history began to surface, Luna's precisely constructed identity as Dylan started to feel heavier than ever, because while she had returned stronger, she had also returned to a place full of recollection she had tried to abolish, and no quantum of confidence could completely silence the echoes of who she used to be. And it was during the night of the fashion show, girdled by flashing cameras, elegant designs, and the vision of perfection, that Luna eventually felt the emotional risk of her double life, because while the world saw Dylan successful and composed, she felt Luna's heart racing beneath the face, flashing back the girl who formerly stood on the sidelines, featuring of a moment like this but no way believing she'd truly belong. And when RJ set up her alone confidentially, gaping at her reflection in the glass as if she were searching for herself beneath the makeup and developer apparel, he realized that her metamorphosis hadn't cancelled her history, it had only buried it, and in that quiet moment, down from the cameras and the prospects, Luna admitted that occasionally she didn't know who she was presently, that changing her face had been easier than changing the way she felt, and RJ, understanding that her strength came at a cost, reminded her that she didn't have to face everything alone, that she could still allow herself to be seen, not as Dylan or Luna, but simply as herself, and though she didn't respond with words, the way her eyes softened told him that she heard him, and as the show went on and the applause filled the room, Luna walked the bottom with confidence, proving that she had reclaimed her place in the world that formerly rejected her, but deep outside, she knew that the real battle wasn't about acceptance, it was about mending, about learning to trust again, and about chancing the courage to let go of the identity she had erected to survive, so she could eventually live. And while the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: Luna's story wasn't just about metamorphosis, it was about adaptability, about reclaiming power in a world that had formerly taken everything from her, and about proving that no matter how important you change on the outside, the trip to mending always begins within. And as RJ watched her move forward, he realized that occasionally the most shocking secrets don't destroy people, they reveal how strong they've always been. As the weeks passed after the fashion show, the emotional fallout from Luna's disclosure continued to reshape the atmosphere at Forrester Creations, because indeed though the public had embraced Dylan as a rising gift in the fashion world, those who knew the verity couldn't separate the polished professional from the wounded girl who had formerly dissolved without a trace, and Luna herself felt the strain of living between two individualities further than ever, because every compliment she entered for her designs reminded her of the days when no bone had believed in her, and every composition praising Dylan's success felt like a memorial that Luna's story had been cancelled from history. And while she told herself that the once no longer signified, the weight of it followed her into every meeting, every photo shoot, every quiet moment alone in her apartment, where the silence was loud enough to force her to defy the feelings she tried so hard to suppress. And RJ, who had come her closest connection to the person she used to be, plotted with his own disagreeing passions, because while he respected the strength she had developed, he couldn't ignore the sadness in her eyes, the way she squinched when exchanges turned particular, or the way she artificially guarded her heart as if awaiting treason at any moment. And the more he saw her retreat behind emotional walls, the more he realized that her metamorphosis hadn't just changed her appearance, it had changed the way she related to the world, replacing trust with caution and stopgap with control. And as rumors continued to circulate both inside and outside the company, Luna set up herself questioning whether returning to Los Angeles had truly been the right choice, because while she had reclaimed her power, she had also restarted injuries she had spent times trying to heal. And yet, despite the emotional risk, she refused to retreat, because walking down again would feel like rendition, and she had formerly fought too hard to rebuild herself to let fear mandate her future. And this determination came indeed more important when a new surge of media attention hovered to expose details of her history that she had worked so hard to leave before, because the intelligencer digging into Forrester's history had begun uncovering inconsistencies girding Luna Nozawa's exposure. And although the world believed Dylan was simply a talented freshman, it was only a matter of time before someone connected the blotches, and Luna knew that another Public reproach could destroy everything she had rebuilt, not just her career, but her sense of control over her own story. And while RJ encouraged her to let the verity come out on her own terms, Luna wasn't ready to relive the demotion, the judgment, and the way her vulnerability had formerly been turned into entertainment. And so she chose silence, choosing rather to concentrate on her work, her designs, and the future she was determined to produce. Indeed, if the once hovered to follow her at every turn, and as the pressure mounted, the emotional distance between Luna and those around her began to grow, because while she remained professional, she stopped participating pieces of herself, retreating into an interpretation of Dylan that felt more like a part than a real identity, and RJ, watching her pull down, couldn't help but feel that the girl he'd reconnected with was sluggishly fading again, not physically this time, but emotionally, and it bothered him, because he'd seen what insulation had done to her ahead, and he stressed that history was repeating itself in a different form. And yet, Luna believed that keeping people at arm's length was the only way to cover herself, because vulnerability had formerly bring her everything, and she wasn't willing to risk losing herself again. And this internal conflict came to a head when an unanticipated face from her once reappeared in Los Angeles, someone who had known her before the metamorphosis, someone who honored her incontinently despite the surgery, and whose presence hovered to unravel the precisely constructed life she had erected. Because while the world saw Dylan, this person saw Luna, the girl who had been hurt, abandoned, and forced to change just to survive, and their unforeseen reappearance stirred feelings Luna allowed. She had buried ever, including wrathfulness, remorse, and a moping sense of untreated business. And when RJ noticed the shift in Luna's jest, the way she came more guarded, more tense, he knew commodity deeper was passing, commodity she wasn't ready to partake, and while he admired her boundaries, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that her history was catching up with her in ways she couldn't control. And as pressures escalated both tête-à-tête and professionally, Luna faced a defining choice, whether to continue hiding behind the identity she had created or eventually defy the emotional trueness she had spent times avoiding. And while the idea of opening up scarified her, she began to realize that true strength wasn't just about reinvention. It was about mending, about admitting the pain without letting it define her, and about allowing herself to be seen for who she truly was, not just who she had come. And as she sluggishly began to lower her guard, participating pieces of her story with RJ, she discovered that connection didn't have to mean vulnerability without boundaries, and that trust didn't have to lead to loss. And while the scars of her history would always be part of her, they no longer had to control her future. And as she continued to navigate the complicated world of Forrester Creations, Luna realized that her topmost metamorphosis wasn't the bone the surgeon had created, it was the one she was still erecting within herself, learning to balance strength with wimpiness, independence with connection, and ambition with authenticity. And while the world might always see Dylan, Luna was eventually beginning to reclaim her own sense of identity, not as a victim, not as a secret, but as a survivor who refused to let her once define her fortune. Even as Luna tried to focus on her work, the tension within Forrester Creations was palpable, because every interaction seemed to carry unspoken questions about her past. And while most of the staff treated her professionally, there were subtle glances, quiet whispers, and sidelong stares that reminded her that no matter how carefully she had constructed Dylan, some part of the world still resisted accepting her transformation. And the realization hit hardest when she overheard a conversation between two designers speculating about her identity, using her old name Luna, and discussing whether she had deliberately returned to manipulate the Forrester empire. And for a fleeting moment, a surge of anger and frustration rose in her, because she had fought tooth and nail to survive, to rebuild herself, and yet here she was, judged not for the talent and vision she brought to the company, but for the scars she carried from a life that had been stolen from her. And RJ, sensing her unease, stepped closer that evening after everyone had left, gently reminding her that people feared what they didn't understand, and that their judgments were a reflection of their own insecurities, not her worth. And hearing those words, Luna felt a mix of relief and sadness, because while RJ's support anchored her, it also highlighted the loneliness of her journey, the isolation of being someone who had been forced to disappear to survive. And yet, despite the emotional weight, she resolved to continue moving forward, embracing her dual identity as both Dylan and Luna, understanding finally that her power lay not in hiding her past, but in choosing how she faced it. And in that quiet, almost imperceptible decision, She reclaimed a piece of herself she had feared lost forever, the part of her that could live fully, unapologetically, and on her own terms, knowing that no matter what the world said, she was no longer the girl who had vanished. She was the woman who had returned, stronger, wiser, and unbreakable.